180 grams. What are 180 grams for you? 180 grams are a little less than a cup of rice. 180 grams doesn't sound much for us, but for Dana Baron, 180 grams are the difference between being able to walk and being in a wheelchair. Dana has a severe case of ALS disease. When Dana's medical cannabis dosage was cut down abruptly in 2015, within 7 weeks, she couldn't walk anymore. She lost 7 kilos, and she was taken to the hospital because it was hard for her to breathe. All of these challenges could have been avoided had Dana been entitled to a required medical cannabis dosage, 180 grams a month. Dana managed to overcome these hardships and made it her life's mission to help other patients like her. As the CEO of the Medical Cannabis Association in Israel, she's fulfilling this important mission. We want to thank Dana for meeting with us and helping us shape the social perspective of the medical cannabis field. In addition to Dana, during our research, we met with various stakeholders that also helped us to understand the entire scope of the medical cannabis world. We also want to thank them for their incredible contribution. My name is Omer, and together with Dina and Talia, we worked on this research for the past year. From the schools of law, government, and communications, we gained interdisciplinary insights regarding the medical cannabis world. Our research begins with one basic problem. People who need medical cannabis simply can't get it. We know that medical cannabis isn't a classic technology, but it's life-changing. And this is why it's so important for us to share our research regarding medical cannabis, how it's regulated and legislated, the problems in its field, the solutions for the regulatory boundaries, why you keep on hearing about new reform that is happening in Israel, and why now, more than ever, is the time to act. As one of the oldest cultivated plants in the world, prominent researchers and clinical studies have shown that medical cannabis can help alleviate pain, slow down, and even regress certain illnesses. To put it shortly, cannabis can literally change people's life. And that's the passion and drive behind our research. The big question we want to ask here tonight is why? Why, with all the plant benefits, why isn't it a standard medical option? Why can't you just walk into the doctor's office and get a prescription for medical cannabis? To understand why not, we will examine here tonight the legal and social challenges in the medical cannabis field. But before we dive into these issues, let's start with the basics.
So, what is cannabis? Cannabis isn't just a weed. Cannabis is a plant composed of more than 400 molecules. We know that for the cannabis plant to be effective, potentially hundreds of these molecules need to work together. Research is just starting to examine which of these 400 are vital for each case, because every cannabis plant is different. There are hundreds of strains, or types, of cannabis. Each strain has different effects and benefits for different people with different diseases. As it turns out, these days are the optimal time to make prominent progress in the medical cannabis field. Why? There are two reasons. The first is that the new government is interested in updating cannabis regulations, and the second is that the High Court of Justice is now deeply involved. If we act now and incorporate the right laws and regulations, we can achieve maximum health benefits and minimal abuse. Let's understand the legal concerns of this field. The first derives from an outdated treaty, and the second deals with the struggle of medicalization. In 1961, 186 countries signed the first and most important treaty regarding narcotics, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. This treaty classifies cannabis as a Schedule I drug, the same category as heroin. Until today, this treaty maintains negative perceptions surrounding cannabis and serves as a massive block for progression. To put it simply, Israel, just like many other countries, still relies on a 60-year-old treaty to dictate its regulation on this new, exciting, and emerging drug. As long as cannabis and heroin are scheduled under the same category, nothing can change. This is why the process of receiving a medical cannabis license in Israel is heavily regulated and is only given as a last resort, if at all. One solution can be treating cannabis as any other medical drug. Simple, right? But just because it sounds simple doesn't mean it's easy. And in fact, medicalizing cannabis is extremely difficult. Let's take a minute to zoom out and understand how a drug is accepted today in the pharmaceutical world. So, what is a drug? A drug is a single molecule substance. This might be hard to wrap your head around, but this means that most of the medicines we take are all based on one single active molecule, a single one. Cannabis is the exact opposite. To what extent? Well, like we said, it's literally composed of more than 400 molecules. For the cannabis plant to be effective, potentially hundreds of these molecules need to be in action. This is called the entourage effect. The rules that were designed for standard manufactured drugs simply don't apply to this plant. It's like trying to shove 400 round pegs in one square hole simultaneously. Under this framework, you're doomed to fail. So let's recap. First, cannabis is legally labeled as a narcotic assumed to have the same risks associated with heroin. And second, there's an inherent clash between current pharmaceutical standards and cannabis's molecular makeup. Unfortunately, there's more bad news. Remember when we said that cannabis and heroin are scheduled under the same category? Well, this is why Israel has placed heavy restrictions on all actors in the medical cannabis field. Because of this, receiving license to grow, process, or use cannabis are close to impossible. To help patients get their licenses more efficiently, the Israeli Medical Cannabis Association, the IMCA, and the Ministry of Health introduced the new Israeli cannabis reform in May 2019.
But the 2019 reform introduced great social challenges for the medical cannabis license holders in Israel. The reform actually left patients worse off than before. Let's talk about the social problems that the reform created. The first problem is that the new reform changed the prescription method so patients are not getting what they need. Let's better understand what that means. Before the reform, patients would get cannabis straight from the growers, allowing them to find a specific strain composed out of the 400 molecules that could help them. Today, under the new reform, the prescription breaks down the plant according to one single ratio of the two main active ingredients in cannabis, THC and CBD. What's the problem? Cannabis is more than THC and CBD. Like we said, it's composed of more than 400 molecules. Effectively, the reform ignores the rest of the plant. With the new reform, doctors are required to follow the guideline of the Green Book, which generalizes patients according to their diseases and outline cannabis treatments. Remember Dana? She's not in the book. What she needs is different than the black and white solutions that the Green Book suggests. Cannabis used to be personalized. Under the new reform, it's no longer personalized. It's generic, and generic simply doesn't do the work. Now, what does it mean for patients? Under the old reform, patients could use 100 different strains, and under the new reform, there are only 16 strains left, and patients suffer the consequences of their strains being discontinued. Essentially, the reform took a complicated substance and dumbed it down according to one single ratio. The second problem we want to address is the cost problem, as the new reform changed the price of cannabis dramatically. Before the reform, there was a unified price of 370 shekels for all amounts. It didn't matter if you got 10 or 80 grams. The price was the same. Under the new reform, patients are paying by the grams. More specifically, 180 shekels per 10 grams. I repeat, 180 shekels per 10 grams. The result is that 64% of patients in Israel are actually paying up to 4 times what they used to pay, sometimes even more. This all sounds pretty crazy, right? Dana thought so too. So she took it upon herself and the Medical Cannabis Association to fight for the 60,000 medical cannabis license holders in Israel. She filed an appeal to the High Court of Justice claiming that the reform disproportionately harms patients' rights and sometimes even damages their health. The High Court then ordered a temporary injunction, a halt in the medical cannabis reform. This all should have been resolved until last March, but sadly, it hasn't been resolved yet. Remember when we said that now is the time to act? This is why. With the freezing of the new medical cannabis reform that left patients worse off than it did pre-2019, and the formation of new leadership in Israel, significant changes in both the legal and social realms are now possible.
To tackle these challenges, our group came up with 4 key solutions. The first is legislation. The new Israeli government should stand up and announce loud and clear that cannabis isn't heroin. It's time for Israel to reclassify cannabis in a less severe category in accordance with its medical benefits, suitable for its medical benefits. For example, Schedule 3, a schedule for drugs which have less chance of abuse and dependence, like ketamine. The second solution is accessibility. In Israel today, there are thousands of patients who can and should be prescribed medical cannabis licenses, but they aren't. The current way to receive a license has to change. Our paper recommends that the Israeli Medical Cannabis Association and the Ministry of Health lower the prescription threshold. No longer should medical cannabis serve as a last resort drug. Our third solution regards the classification. The CBD-THC ratio system caused patients to lose the strains that have once helped them. We urge the Ministry of Health and the IMCA to cancel it until a more adequate classification system is introduced. And our fourth solution deals with the price. The steep rise in medical cannabis prices denied patients the only relief to their pain. We believe that the solution is to lower medical cannabis prices and make it accessible to patients whose quality of life depends on it. 2 solutions can be adding it to the health basket or subsidizing by health insurance companies. And the bottom line is that the time to act is now. We saw today that medical cannabis holds vast potential to improve the quality of life of people who need it, but the social and legal barriers which derive from the scheduling system lead to overly strict regulation and great social issues. But if Israel will reclassify cannabis in a less severe category in accordance with its medicinal benefits and solve the problems that the reform caused, we can properly regulate cannabis. And by doing that, we can make it accessible to patients when they need it most. Because cannabis can't be a last resort drug. People who need it should get it. Thank you.